My question was, what social factors influence general ideologies? A look at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville students in the College of Arts and Sciences. I forgot I had these two. My research question is basically focusing on, does the perception of gender roles vary among SIUE physical science students and social science students? Background. The meaning of gender has been socially constructed into male and female. This basically means that we focus more on the biological differences, which creates no room for fluidity between the genders. Traditional gender roles reinforce this social construction. A woman's role was to keep the man happy and take care of the household while the man was earning the family income. Previous research shows that women are underrepresented in physical science disciplines. Physical science disciplines are assumed to be more masculine, and traditional gender roles steer women away from it. Sociological significance. A need exists for continuing research. There is limited research available on the correlation between college major and gender role perceptions. The studies that are being done focus more on why women are underrepresented instead of does your major have an effect on your ideologies. Studies show that exposure to egalitarian viewpoints positively correlates to an egalitarian perception of gender roles. It's interesting to see if one's perception can be influenced by class that they take. Can you see the yellow part? Yellow part of the picture. Past research, gender ideology can be defined basically as the views one's hold about gender roles. Some perceive that the division of labor in their household is unequal. Conservative viewpoints don't see this as a problem. Time availability can be considered as free time inside the home or outside the home. It can be without a job, a salary job. Those who perceive themselves to not have enough time to have a wage job and do household labor will divert the household labor to their partner. Resource dependence can be anything from financial, shelter, food, basic needs. Dependence creates power determines gender roles, and studies show that women are more likely to have this dependence because of traditional gender roles, how they force them away from economic opportunities. Past research continued. Level of education. Level of education can be considered of how much school you have completed in your lifetime. People are apt to cultural change with the increase of education they receive. It's shown that the parents that have graduated college are more likely to allow their female children to go into science roles because they've been around it. Religion. Religion is rooted in classical conservative viewpoints. I basically asked the perception of religion. Religious text stresses the demands of the home for the female before the demands of the marketplace. Degree, college, major. I'm focusing on physical and science majors. Physical science majors and social science majors, sorry. Women are underrepresented in physical science majors. Men are overrepresented in higher economic positions. This includes, engineering, doctors, stuff that are physical science majors. Theory. Feminist theory examines the social roles of women and also takes into account women's oppression and the ways and means to empower women. This basically helps me explain the social construction of gender roles and how discrimination, sexual objectification, and rights allotted to women are formed. Doing gender theory expresses that there is a social norm at which gender is to be displayed, creating a separation between what is considered masculine and feminine. This basically helps us understand that the biological sex and the social gender is supposed to match in society, and we see hyper-gender roles such as wrestlers who over-display masculinity, they make a high salary, and then housewives on TV who over-display sexuality, they over-display taking care of the home, they don't have jobs, and this allows for no fluidity within the genders. Intersectionality is the concept that race, class, and gender all play a role in the oppression experienced by a person or group. This helps us understand that there's varying degrees at which a person feels oppression because of other issues such as race, class, religion. And to understand the degree that's being felt, you need to understand the disparities among the group. Child theory is the idea that our emotions affect our daily lives and decisions. This basically means like the stigma and backlash that you feel, it will act as an oppressor to keep you within the traditional gender roles so that you stay within what's socially acceptable. This is just a little summary chart of the variables that I used on the survey that measure the variables and then the theory that I used to explain it. I'm only going to be focusing today for time purposes on the ones that I used in the survey, on the PowerPoint. So it will start out with gender ideology. I use intersectionality in doing gender theory to explain how race, class, gender, and sexuality measure gender ideology. Intersectionality explains that minorities are oppressed by the majority in the social construction. And the doing gender theory stresses that because of opportunities allowed in society, that the majority is white heterosexual males. So then we'll go to feminist theory and college degree, college major. I asked the question on the survey, what was your major? And then I separated that into physical science student and social science student. Feminist theory stresses the opportunities allowed that physical science classes are considered to be more masculine, while social science studies have shown that people think social science classes are cognitively easier and for women. Oh, one more. Sorry. And then Child theory for religion and perception of religion. Religious text, as I said before, stresses the importance of the demands of the home before the marketplace. This creates a fear inside of women that will keep them within the traditional gender roles because they don't want to offend their religion. So, based on the theory in my previous research that I've looked up, I have hypothesized for these variables. For college major, I hypothesized that physical science students will hold a conservative perception, while social science students will hold an egalitarian perception. My hypothesis for religion is that those who are religious will hold a conservative perception. My hypothesis for race is that those who are Caucasian will hold a conservative perception. Methods. My research is only looking at students within the College of Arts and Science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. I surveyed 199 students from physical science and social science classes, so I split that up into an even amount. I completed a deductive quantitative survey. I wanted to test the theory. I didn't want to know why it was occurring. The survey was anonymous and completely confidential. Findings. I used Pearson's chi-square test of significance to find out if I had a statistically significant results. This test is most appropriate because I'm comparing the demographics of those who answer conservatively to those who answer with an egalitarian viewpoint. Statistical significance means the chi-square value must be less than the p-value. Findings. Physical science or social science students, I found, as you can see, there's like a higher overall percentage in the physical science group to have a conservative viewpoint, while there's a higher overall percentage of social science student group to have an egalitarian viewpoint. I found that the chi-square value was 0.004, which is less than the p-value of 0.05. Therefore, we accept the hypothesis that major affects gender ideologies. For religion, as you can see, the total group of people that perceive themselves to be religious doesn't really differ that much from the total group that people perceive themselves to be not religious. So the chi-square value was 6.86, and this is greater than the p-value of 0.05. Therefore, we reject the hypothesis that religion affects gender ideologies. And for race, I found a chi-square value of 0.002. This is less than the p-value of 0.05. Therefore, we accept the hypothesis that race affects gender ideologies. My limitations. I originally emailed 17 professors, and with time constraints, it's the end of the year. I only had 7 professors get back to me in a timely manner. This greatly affected the number of participants that I can include in my survey. I only had 199. I feel like this might not be an accurate group that would describe the whole physical science and social science areas. Let's see. There's a potential for false response to avoid stigma. People can perceive themselves to think that they may be, more gender neutral, but their behavior might actually not be that way. And then quantitative research doesn't answer why something is occurring, so I don't really know why my results are the way they are. Conclusions. My question again was, does the perception of gender role vary among SIUE physical science students and social science students in the College of Arts and Science? College major and race correlate to having an effect on gender role perception. Doing gender explains that college major has an effect on the gender roles because of the social construction of gender roles. Like if your views are socially constructed, so people that have a physical science major and not exposed to such things as egalitarian viewpoints might not have conservative perception. So, and then intersectionality basically says that impressions minorities feel. Intersectionality basically explains that minorities might feel the way, might have a more minorities might have a more egalitarian approach because of oppressions they have already felt. They might be more aware that the oppression is based on them, and they might want to try to counteract these. Policy implications. Previous research suggests that a development of an education system that takes into account gender differences as well as gender similarities in order to combat underrepresentation of women in the physical science area. Also, studies suggest that advice from role models can influence a student to break traditional gender roles. This all relates back to the studies on exposure. If you have more exposure to egalitarian viewpoints, you're more likely to be accepting to them. This is just my special thanks. I thank Dr. Markowitz for helping me develop my question in 302, Dr. Finkelstein for providing guidance throughout Sociology 495, Professor Steiner for just helping with my paper and stuff, and Dr. Davis for helping me with my survey, and then SIUE students. Okay. And then this is
Questions for Kyle?
Can I ask you a question, Kyle?
Yes.
So I know when we had class together, we talked a lot about gender roles versus ideologies, and I saw you sort of moved back and forth between those terms. So my first question is, what's the difference between those terms?
I think gender roles are more like what you're doing and like how you're acting, while your gender ideology is how you're perceived to be acting. Basically.
So your beliefs?
Yeah.
So in terms of your theory, what I thought was interesting is that your theory would predict that everybody would have the same gender ideology, but indeed, right, there's feminist theory, there's oppression, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But in fact, you're trying to argue, no, that's not true. People will have different ideologies. So tell me, I was confused about how your theory related.
Let's just go. In like example, in the example of intersectionality and doing gender for gender ideology, I just think that I feel that intersectionality and doing gender would explain that the minority would be oppressed by the majority. So, like, I feel like the majority would be more likely to have a different viewpoint because, excuse me, I think the majority would be more likely to have a different viewpoint compared to the minority because the majority sets the viewpoint while the minority is the threat to the viewpoint. Maybe I should explain it through a different theory instead of that one. Like, because the feminist theory, the opportunities granted to women will be more likely to have them to have an egalitarian viewpoint because they'd be in a social setting where they were exposed to more egalitarian viewpoints, while men are pushed to physical science. You know what I mean? I'm not going to get it this way, but
Yeah, you just want to make sure, because you're also doing majors, so you don't want to
yeah.
do the interaction. So just gender, why might women have more egalitarian ideologies than men that don't have to do with majors? Just why might women have more egalitarian ideologies?
Well, I was thinking religion and my other variables. Like the other, how intersectionality, the other variables that play as the pressures on women. I think I'm just confused about the question, and so.
Oh, okay. No problem.
Sorry. Yes.
Hi. Can you go back to the slide in the path diagram?
Yes.
We have the arrows and stuff. Very impressive. I like the way it did summarize things. Just if you weren't here to talk about it and it was just like in a paper or something, those arrows technically mean causality.
Oh, okay.
And so you in this case, bullets might have been, but you explained it well. So, and then also with causality, it can go either way. So each of those lines can have arrows on both sides. So like college degree doesn't cause college major.
Yeah.
But if somebody was to read this in a journal, they would assume that's what you meant. So it's just a formatting issue, no big deal.
Okay.
And another thing, you meant professional wrestling, not wrestling.
Professional.
Yeah, just so.
Yeah, he threw that up a little
Just
bit.
so Mike doesn't.
I was looking nervous.
Yeah, I knew what you meant. I know the video
Yeah.
you're talking
was
about.
not
Yeah,
happy.
so that's good. That's good.
Sorry.
In terms of your hypotheses, did I just miss what you meant by conservative?
Conservative, I'm using it as traditional gender roles.
And
I probably didn't say that.
and what does traditional mean?
Traditional
Yeah,
means
what
like-
were the attributes that make something? I mean, you did chi-square, so it is conservative or liberal, or conservative or not conservative. But what did you mean by that exactly?
I asked questions in my survey that were like, would you feel comfortable having a male babysitter? Do you feel that the household chores should be, do you feel the household chores should be equal? Or do you think a wife should stay home with the family while a man's out? So I'm using traditional gender roles to measure people that believe like the wife should be home with the family while the man's the breadwinner. And then egalitarian viewpoint I'm using as like the wife can have options while the male can have options and it's equal.
And so did you add up the conservative answers
I
versus the
computed,
non-conservative?
I
And so it's
computed.
kind of like is that an index or a scale?
An index.
It's an index, so it's like an index. Yeah. And just the last thing, you interpreted your statistics correctly. And so that was nice that your statements were a little bit confusing. So it's not whether or not chi-squared is less than the p-value. Every chi-squared has a p-value. Is that p-value less than or equal to 0.05?
Oh.
And so your interpretation was correct, that the statement was kind of confusing.
Okay.
And this was not a random sample, right?
No.
Yeah, and so there should be a sentence in there somewhere saying that, making that explicit, because then the chi-squared has a question mark on it rather than an exclamation point, since it wasn't a random sample. Good job.
Any other questions?
Okay. My name is Michael Dace. This is my senior assignment. My thesis is, are sentencing outcomes affected at a state level based on poverty and minority population of that state? Sociology is the study of people and how they interact with one another in the context of a community. My thesis focuses on how people are sentenced and punished differently based on specific variables of each state. This is important to ask from a sociological standpoint because it shows how people routinely manifest either a state of ignorance or tolerance to the fact that unequal treatment is still present today in our society. A lot of past research done on sentencing disparities was conducted at an individual level data. But because of legal purposes, I had to use state level data. But for the past research, I will be using individual level data to help explain, will this foreshadow the outcome of state level data? The state level independent variables I decided to use were percent of minority population in the state and the percent of poverty in the state. I found these comparable and relatable to the individual level independent variables of race and economic status. First, I'll begin by talking about a little bit literature on minorities. Jordan Freeberger found disparities do exist for minorities dealing with the criminal justice system. This could be length, severity of punishment. For example, a study done in 1993 by the U.S. Justice Department Bureau showed that African American offenders, on average, received a sentence of 2 years longer when compared to those of Caucasians. It's also the type of sentence that an individual will receive that is influenced by race. This could be probation, jail time, fines, and even dismissal. Thornberry's research shows Caucasians are 20% more likely to receive a punishment of probation when compared to those of African Americans. He also goes on to state that African Americans were 20% more likely to be institutionalized when compared to that of Caucasians. This brings me to my first hypothesis, which is as the percent of minorities in a state rises, so does the average percent of sentence served. My hypothesis states there will be a positive correlation between the independent variable, which is percent of minorities in a state, and the dependent variable, which is percent of sentence served. So what this means is that as one goes up, the other will go up, or as one goes down, the other will go down. I came up with this hypothesis through past research, my own analysis, critical race theory, and the significance I found on an individual level. This brings me to my first theory, which is the critical race theory. Critical race theory states that the race is a social construct. They go on further to say that Caucasians have all the privileges and power, and on the opposite side, minorities dealing with the criminal justice system are powerless. Therefore, they are exposed to stereotyping, racism, and unfair prosecution. An ideal world would be a colorblind world, but in our world, the norm is Caucasians and the deviant is minorities. I decided to use critical race theory because critical race theory states that minorities experience disparities when dealing with the criminal justice system. By applying this critical race theory to the research question, the outcomes of sentences should be affected based on the minority population of each state. This brings me to my literature on economic status and poverty. There are many reasons why poverty level and economic status are believed to affect an outcome in the criminal justice system. The most simplistic is financial needs. Money can be an important resource when dealing with the criminal justice system. If you have money, you can afford to get a private lawyer who has resources, skills, and the time necessary to provide a successful defense. And on the other hand, people of poverty or no money are often stuck with court-appointed lawyers. They lack the dedication, skills, resources, and time needed to provide a successful defense. Furthermore, there are laws and policies created to protect the higher class, and laws are created to control the poor and minorities. Take white-collar crime versus street-collar crime, for instance. White-collar crime could affect a wide range or numerous people, but there's little or no punishment for that crime. When compared to street crime, which is pretty medial, you could maybe harm 1-2 people, and it's punished way harsher when compared to that punishment of white-collar crime. The individual level data collected helps acknowledge the theory that money, status, and poverty do have an effect on the severity of punishment. The individual level data foreshadows my second hypothesis. The level of poverty in a state will raise the average length of sentence served. Using the individual level data as my basis, I'm going to hypothesize that there will be a positive correlation between percentage of minority in a state and average percent of sentence. This again would be an up-up or a down-down correlation. I came up with this hypothesis from past research, applying the residential segregation theory and my own analysis. This brings me to my second theory, which is residential segregation theory. Residential segregation is the theory that groups of people are separated and live in different areas. This segregation is due partly to a socioeconomic or racial indifference between the groups. This segregation can lead to disadvantages for low economic or minority people. Furthermore, laws and policies are created to control low economic people. Crimes more likely to be committed in low economic areas are punished harsher when compared to those of traditional higher economic crimes. Take crack versus cocaine, for instance. Crack is a diluted, less pure form of cocaine, yet it's punished harsher by law than cocaine. The belief, applying this with the residential segregation theory, this is because crack is dominated mostly by people of low economic status, such as homeless people, you hear prostitutes, things like that. Cocaine, on the other hand, is more higher economic standing people, people with power and money, and so that's why that crime is not as punished as harsh as crack, because they're trying to control the low economic people and give a break to the higher economic people. I chose to use residential segregation theory because it supports my hypothesis that the level of poverty in a state will raise the average length of sentence served. So by applying this theory, my hypothesis, the percent of poverty in a state rises, so will the percent of sentence served. Now I'll move on to my methods section. I decided to use quantitative research because I thought it was appropriate for the level of analysis. I'm looking at a widespread concept of all the states and how these variables affect the amount of sentence served, and to understand that I felt like quantitative would show the hard numbers that are needed to understand this. I decided to use a secondary data set that I received from the ICPSR. This data set was collected from all 50 states in the year 2002. The data looked at incarceration rates in the United States broken down by state and other different variables. The variables I'll be using, the dependent variable is the percent of sentence served, and the independent variable is percent of minorities in a state and percent of poverty in a state. The objective of this study is to measure the percent of sentence served is affected when certain variables are controlled for. The level of measurement was interval ratio. Knowing this, I decided to use the linear regression test as my statistical test. I chose the linear regression test because it will measure the relationship between the dependent variable, which is amount of sentence served, and the two independent variables, percent of minorities and percent of poverty in the state. Here are my first findings for the dependent variable, percent of sentence served, and the independent variable, percent of minorities. Showed an adjusted R-square of negative 1.3, which shows that there is a low amount of variance. Really the only thing I'm looking at is the significance and the standardized coefficient for time constraints. The significance was a 0.549, which really is not that significant. The standardized coefficient is negative 0.087, which shows a weak negative correlation. This correlation would null my hypothesis that the percent of minorities goes up, so will the percent of sentence served. This also rejects my critical race theory. Applying the critical race theory to explain this data, we look at the past literature of critical race. It's not only the amount of sentence served that is affected by race, but also the chance of receiving a punishment of jail time. In high minority areas would mean that there's a higher chance that more people would serve jail time. This could cause to overpopulation in the prison systems, which would leave the government no choice but to release people earlier. Applying this theory even further, it's not the minorities that are being released in these areas, but it's the people that are Caucasian living in these high minority areas that are being released early from prison. Next are my findings for my independent variable as percent of poverty in the state and my dependent variable as percent of sentence served. The standardized coefficient is a negative 0.335, which shows a negative strong correlation. This again nulls my hypothesis that as the percent of poverty in the state goes up, so will the percent of sentence served. Applying this to my theory, the data rejects the residential segregation theory, but this can be explained because as poverty in a state rises, so does the amount of criminal activity. What this would in turn do is raise the amount of arrest rates, which would in turn raise the amount of people in prison, which again would overpopulate the prison system, making people being released earlier than they would like to. But again, this is not the people of poverty or low economic status that are being released early from prison, but the people of high economic status with money and lawyers that can get around this because of the overpopulation. Because both my hypotheses were disproven when I ran the independent variables separately, I wondered, what if I ran both the independent variables simultaneously with the dependent variable, percent of sentence served? Would the results differ or would they stay the same? When I looked at this, the standardized coefficient for poverty did stay in the same direction of a negative correlation of 0.361. But when I looked at the coefficient for minority, it turned from a negative correlation to a positive correlation. Although this correlation was not very strong and there was no statistical significance, the jump from a negative correlation to a positive correlation when taking poverty into account provides me with reasoning on why my hypothesis might have been null. Although people in high poverty state or high populated minority areas have a low percent of sentence served, it's not the minorities or poverty stricken people that are serving the low percent of sentences, but the Caucasians and wealthier people that are being cut these breaks. This will move me on to my final slide, which is policy implications. The first policy implication would be the government shouldn't create laws to control specific types of people, as we talked about with the crack and cocaine and the white collar crime or street collar crime. My next policy implication is equality in laws. I think the punishment should fit the crime, not the punishment fit the offender. Because right now it seems in our community, as we talked about, people of high economic status are being given breaks while people of race and low economic status are getting punished. So, and my third policy and final policy implication would be people need to become educated to the idea that there is still work to be done to achieve equality. And that's it.
Questions from Mike?
Well, there's a couple things. So when you say null hypothesis, actually, so your null hypothesis suggests that there's not a relationship, so you just say, I have to accept the null hypothesis.
Okay.
But in terms of a question, and I thought that was really interesting, I think maybe your unit of analysis may have been the culprit for why you don't see a relationship.
I would plan on using individual level for the longest time, and then when I tried starting to run it, it wouldn't let me access the variables and the things that I needed because they said I would be able to tell who people are, and they wanted me to like get a bunch of permission from like email the government. It just wasn't. So I figured I would by explaining with individual level, like maybe I could see if there's a connection between the individual and the state. Obviously, it's harder to determine what it is statewide. It's not what I expected it to be, but yeah, that's why.
And Connie, you probably know this. Oh, but Connie's not here. Connie, pretend like you're here. So neighborhood may be actually better. The individual, I don't think would be great, but the neighborhood, then you could get residential segregation.
Okay.
Or county even, Denise.
I think even if you could go ahead so that you could get data at the census block level.
Okay.
Right, or at the census tract level. Like if you get it at kind of the block group level or the tract level. It's just when you think about a state as a whole, you can't think about residential segregation at that level. It just, to know the percent minority in the state really doesn't tell us anything about segregation in that state. There could be varying degrees of segregation, but so I think that's it. You also just have the trickiness of you kind of make claims about individuals at times, like who's serving these, what percentage of their sentence, and we just can't know that from these data.
Yeah.
And I understand your desire to do so. We just are limited by the data you have.
I agree.
I'm a little, can I interrupt?
You may.
Okay, so can we look at your slide again? Because
Which one?
particularly the one with poverty as your independent variable, because it's part of it is I'm just not accustomed to seeing the table laid out that way.
Okay, yeah, I had it the other way, and they suggested I do it in Excel. It'd be easier to read.
We couldn't.
But I did have it in a different form. Where is this at here? This is minorities.
That's the first one.
So this would be.
That's the one.
Because we could not see what.
Yeah, another one.
So that significance there, is that the significance of the model or the significance of the parameter estimate for your independent variable?
You know what? I'm not too familiar with SPSS, but if I look on the other one, I did put it on there. This would be the level of confidence for the effect out of the independent variable.
Unless you've gotten the statistical significance of the constant, the significance of the model and the significance of the independent variable should be the same in a bivariate regression, right? So that implies you did find a statistically significant relationship between
the poverty one, the minority one was the one.
Okay, so you didn't describe it that way.
Okay, yeah.
And
not the
unless
the statistics.
No, it's okay. But you do have something, right? So something about percent minority explains this. I can't remember what the R square was, but I think about 11% of the variance in percent of sentence served. Can
Yeah.
you go back to that slide?
Was that the?
Just a couple ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Other way.
Other way.
This one, the new method.
Oh, this would be fine too. So here, significance of poverty. See the significance of poverty is 0.02?
Yeah.
That number is less than 0.05, right?
Yeah.
So it suggests that there's a statistically significant relationship between percent poverty in the state and percentage time of sentence served.
Yeah.
Even controlling for a percent minority population.
Yeah.
So you have something in the bivariate, and it holds up, even controlling for percent minority.
Yeah.
So you really have something interesting, although complicated, to talk about. I mean,
Well, I also did it by region at one time, but I just didn't have enough time. I wanted to get my main point. But I did region as well, where I did like the upper East Coast compared to the down South. And it was funny because I looked at one state and it had the highest percent of, it was down South, I think it was Mississippi, had the highest percentage of minorities and the highest percentage of poverty. And then when I looked at the upper East Coast, it was one state that had the lowest percentage of minorities and the lowest percentage of poverty. And I compared those, and I found a lot of interesting things about that, but I just, with the time constraints and the tables, it was
no,
too much.
I'm with you, but you have something here, so could you just tell us what it means, right? So you found that the percent minority population, percent poverty in a state is statistically related to the percent of the sentence served in aggregate, the average percent served, and that's even controlling for percent minority population. So based on that coefficient, what does it tell you?
Well, it tells me that obviously people with higher percent poverty get
States with.
yeah,
Your
has
unit
a
is the
correlation.
states with.
Has a negative correlation with sentence served. But again, I thought that was because people are getting arrested more, and then the jails are becoming overpopulated, so they had no choice but to let people go, especially in places of high poverty, because I'm guessing places of high poverty probably don't have a lot of resources and money for the jails. So like they can't just say, oh, let's just build more on, or let's do this. They don't have many resources, so they really have no choice but to be like, okay, you can go on probation or do this or court supervision, because they have to let the new people come in, so they have to take the old people out. And so that was kind of what, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Getting closer, so that.
Can I piggyback
Yes.
on that? Is it possible to ever have a negative R squared? That's impossible,
So
right?
yeah.
So I'm not sure what, on your other slide, you have an adjusted R squared that's negative, and I don't know if that's mathematically possible. So I don't know if
This
it's,
one or
No.
the next one?
So I think the only way.
Maybe
Yeah,
that
right.
just might have just been like, I might have put that in on accident. I don't know. I'm not like
yeah, it's
super
confusing.
familiar with the whole.
I
I know like the basic understanding of the statistics thing.
My
but-
main comment, and this actually makes it a whole lot simpler for you, is that this is a census of all 50 states. So it doesn't have to be statistically significant at all.
Okay.
All you have to look at is the coefficients.
That's true.
Because you have a census, you don't have to, since you already know that this is true for the 50
Yeah, it's all
states.
50
You're not
You don't have
estimating
to
anything.
generalize
This is what it is.
It's a parameter
Yeah.
rather than a
So it
statistic.
actually makes your job a whole lot easier.
Where you at
looking
on that one,
50.
Clay?
That didn't cross my mind.
And just theoretically, I think the link, if you ever wanted to do this further, would be how do these, if you wanted to stay at the state level, how do these characteristics affect the parole board policies?
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are deciding what percent of that.
Yeah, I kind of went in that with like, I feel like if you have money, obviously your lawyer can get access to the parole board, talk to them, or at least, convince
Or just the parole board itself.
Yeah.
If it's in a poor state, they don't have the tax base, they can't keep people in prison, so the parole board policy is going to be let more people out early.
Okay.
So if you think of that parole board